No trumpet, no assassin's mask, just silence, and a knife in the back. The Ides of March were supposed to be ordinary, like any other day on the Roman calendar where politics spilled into temples and sandals slapped the marble floors of the Curia. But history doesn't whisper when it's about to break its own spine. It explodes. And on that day, it exploded into the heart of Rome with 23 knife wounds. There was no dramatic speech, no trial, just Julius Caesar, the man who rewrote destiny, sprawled on the Senate floor like a butchered myth. His blood pooled on the same stones where the Republic once stood proud, now cracked beneath the weight of ambition, betrayal, and centuries of resentment. But before the betrayal, before the blade met flesh, before Brutus looked into his mentor's eyes and chose loyalty to an idea over love for a man, there was Caesar. Not the dead dictator, not the marble statue, not the textbook icon, the living, breathing, dangerously brilliant Roman who bent history with every step he took. And if you're ready to walk with him, you'll need more than courage. You'll need to forget everything you thought you knew about heroes, tyrants, and the fragile line that separates greatness from doom. Caesar wasn't born into power. He wasn't supposed to rise. He wasn't even the obvious choice for anything. Just another ambitious patrician in a city overflowing with egos, politics, and senatorial drama. His family name, Julii, was respectable but not legendary. His early life was marked by exile, by survival, by the sharp instinct of a man who realized early that Rome didn't reward the good, it rewarded the clever. And Caesar, even in his youth, wasn't just clever. He was terrifyingly strategic. He aligned with Marius when it was dangerous. He defied Sulla when it was suicidal. And when the storm passed, he emerged not as a martyr, but as a survivor. That was Caesar's first superpower. Not charm, not swordplay, not oratory, though he had all those in abundance. It was survival. And survival in Rome was the first step toward conquest. He didn't conquer Rome by marching on it with an army, at least not at first. He conquered it socially, politically, intimately. He seduced the people before he seduced power. He wore the laurel wreath not just as a general, but as a performer. He borrowed enormous sums to host festivals, games, spectacles that turned bread and circus into a full-time business. The people adored him. Not because he was kind, he wasn't. Not because he was just, he often wasn't. But because he knew them, understood their hunger, their boredom, their yearning for a man who didn't just talk about greatness, but radiated it. Every speech, every gesture, every calculated act of public generosity was also a dagger pointed at the heart of the old republic. He smiled, he gave, he listened, but beneath it all, he was moving, quietly, purposefully, toward absolute control. Then came Gaul, that savage, brutal, muddy playground of blood and glory. Caesar didn't just fight the Gallic tribes, he annihilated them. And with every tribe he crushed, every river he crossed, every fortress he razed, he grew stronger, bolder, more myth than man. His commentaries weren't just war reports. They were propaganda masterpieces, written in third person, painting himself as the reluctant hero burdened by destiny. Meanwhile, he slaughtered hundreds of thousands, enslaved even more, and rewrote the map of Western Europe in Roman ink. The Senate back in Rome applauded the victories and trembled at the man delivering them. He wasn't just a general. He was a god marching toward the Tiber. When the war ended, The Republic expected him to step back, to come home, to disband his legions, bow to the Senate, and accept the limitations of power. Caesar laughed. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just gave the order. And the Rubicon was crossed, not just a river, but a Rubicon of history, of law, of restraint. When he led his army into Italy, Rome didn't fight back. Pompey fled, the Senate scattered, and the people cheered. That was the moment Caesar became more than mortal. He became inevitable. He offered pardons instead of purges, peace instead of persecution. But don't mistake that for weakness. It was strategy. Caesar knew that mercy is just cruelty wearing perfume. The ones you spare become dependent, grateful, and in their gratitude, they forget they were ever your enemies. The dictatorship wasn't declared. It emerged, like fog. One moment he was first consul, then dictator for a year, then 10 years, then forever. He rewrote the calendar. He restructured the Senate. He passed laws, not by vote, but by command. He stacked magistrates, named priests, took honors usually reserved for gods. Statues were erected, temples renamed, his face on coins, his name in oaths, and yet he kept the Senate, kept the rituals, kept the illusion of a republic crumbling under his sandal. He knew theater. He knew that as long as people felt like the republic still existed, they wouldn't rise against the man who killed it. He was the storm wearing the mask of order. But power doesn't come without enemies, and Caesar, for all his genius, made them in legions, not the poor, not the people, the elites, the optimates, the guardians of the old world who saw in Caesar not a savior, but an executioner with a laurel crown. They whispered of kingship, of monarchy, of Rome's darkest fear, another Tarquin, another tyrant. And Caesar, in a moment of either arrogance or calculation, brushed too close to that line. He refused a crown once, twice, but the message was clear. He didn't need a crown. He already ruled like a king, and kingship in Rome was a death sentence. They came for him not because he was brutal. He wasn't, not by Roman standards. They came for him because he was winning, because the game was over, because Caesar had made himself into a sun and the rest of Rome's stars were fading in his glare. The senators who stabbed him weren't defending liberty. They were defending relevance, defending memory. They weren't patriots. They were actors in a bloody play hoping their daggers would make them immortal. And maybe they did, but not in the way they wanted, because when the knives fell, they didn't kill a tyrant. They birthed an empire. Caesar died with his eyes open, with betrayal in front of him, with Brutus, his protege, his surrogate son, plunging steel into the man who made him. 23 wounds, some symbolic, some savage, the Senate floor soaked in the blood of the only man who could have saved the Republic or destroyed it entirely. And maybe that's the point. Caesar was both. He was Rome's brightest flame and the arsonist who set it alight. He gave the people bread and spectacle, but took their voice. He offered order and security, but murdered consensus. He was a hero to the masses, a dictator to the elite, and a victim of the very system he outplayed. And when the dust settled, when the chants faded, when the senators walked out with trembling hands and red-soaked togas, they didn't walk into applause. They walked into chaos, into war, into Octavian. Because Caesar didn't die quietly. His death was a drumbeat that summoned vengeance. Rome would bleed for years. Republics would crumble. Names would be forgotten. But Caesar, his name would become a title, an empire, a legacy too big for marble or myth to contain. He wasn't just murdered. He was martyred by history, remade by ambition, and resurrected by every man who ever dreamed of ruling forever. So ask again, who was Julius Caesar? Hero, dictator, victim? The answer is yes. He was all of them. He was the man who rose too high to fall softly. The man who walked into the Senate unguarded because he believed he was untouchable. The man who rewrote history, not with parchment, but with blood. And in the silence after his death, Rome didn't breathe easier. It screamed. Because the Republic didn't return, it shattered, and from the shards the empire was born. All hail Caesar. Not for what he ruled, but for what he destroyed in the process of trying to save it. No crown, no sword, just a name and a whisper. Long before the Rubicon, long before Gaul turned red beneath his boots, long before the Edicts of March bled 23 silent syllables into marble, there was a boy with no throne, no army, no future except what he dared to steal from fate. The boy was Gaius Julius Caesar, and the world into which he was born did not yet know it would kneel to that name. But Rome did whisper, not in words, but in hunger, in rot, in the grinding of politics and bones. It whispered through the cracked walls of its temples and the dust between its cobblestones. It whispered to him. Before he could even speak, Rome had already started asking, what if he is the one? The year was 100 BCE. The Republic was crumbling, though it hadn't yet admitted it. Power pulsed between men, not laws. Swords carried more authority than scrolls. Ambition was not a sin. It was the only virtue that mattered. Caesar was born into the Patrician Julii, a name ancient enough to command respect, but not wealthy enough to dominate. He carried the blood of Venus, or so they claimed, but not the fortune to match. His family was noble, but irrelevant. Proud but fading, a whisper of power in a city that screamed for dominance. And Caesar, the child, heard all of it. He didn't grow up dreaming of power. He grew up surrounded by it, suffocated by it, constantly reminded of how far his family had fallen from it. His father, a minor governor, died when Caesar was a teenager. His mother, Aurelia, was steel beneath silk, one of the few figures in his life who understood that Rome didn't nurture its sons, it tested them. She saw what others missed, that her boy was watching, absorbing, becoming. She didn't raise a child. She sharpened a weapon. Then came Sulla, the butcher, the storm, the dictator who made the streets run slick with blood and called it order. Sulla was everything Caesar was not, old, cynical, hardened by civil war. And he feared youth, feared idealism, feared legacy. So when Caesar, barely a man, refused to divorce his wife, the daughter of Marius's faction, Sulla saw a threat, a name with ambition, a spark too dangerous to ignore. He ordered Caesar to comply. Caesar refused. Just like that, the boy became an enemy of the state. No army, no allies, just a name and a death sentence. But Caesar didn't die. He vanished into alleyways, backwaters, shadows. He fled Rome like a ghost of a future too bright to snuff out. The young noble became an outlaw, hiding in mud-stained cloaks, moving under false names, protected by debts of loyalty and whispers of potential. Even Sulla hesitated, allegedly muttering, "There's many a Marius in that boy." And he was right. But Caesar wouldn't be Marius or Sulla. He would be something worse, or better, depending on where you stood when history broke open. Exile didn't destroy him, it refined him. When the danger passed, Caesar returned, not with vengeance, but with vision. He was leaner, smarter, quieter, a serpent learning patience. He studied rhetoric in Rhodes, endured capture by pirates who would live to regret it, and began walking the tightrope between public favor and private ambition. Every speech was a blade, every gesture a rehearsal. He didn't shout his intentions, he smiled them. He understood that in Rome, the appearance of virtue was worth more than virtue itself. So he wore the mask, played the part, waited. Politics came next. He began to rise, not with war, but with words. As an orator, he burned. As a lawyer, he pierced. As a populist, he seduced. The people didn't just hear Caesar, they felt him. He wasn't a nobleman. He was Rome wrapped in human skin, hungry, restless, incurably ambitious. He gave them games, lavish feasts, public works that bore his name in stone. He didn't buy their love. He earned it by pretending he already had it. But the Senate watched. The optimates scowled. They saw the boy in the toga and heard the thunder in his footsteps. He was too polished, too generous, too perfectly beloved. And behind every smile, they sensed the shadow of a crown. But they couldn't touch him. Not yet. He moved too carefully, married too wisely, allied too shrewdly. He was becoming a storm wrapped in silk. Then came the priesthoods, the political ladder, the sacred offices. He took them all. Not as steps, but as trophies. To others, titles were destinations. To Caesar, they were disguises. He became Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Roman religion, before he could even grow a proper beard. But make no mistake, Caesar didn't believe in the gods. He believed in the power of men who claimed to speak for them. And now he was one of those men. Even then, he wasn't content. He joined the military, not out of duty, but calculation. Every battle, every victory, every scar carved into his skin was an audition for a role history had not yet written. He studied war not as a science, but as theatre. He knew the audience, knew the stakes, knew that blood dried, but stories didn't. And so the young soldier returned to Rome, not as a hero, but as a legend in training. The first triumvirate came like a secret pact with the fates. Crassus, rich enough to buy the Senate. Pompey, beloved by the legions. And Caesar, the upstart who made both men necessary. It was an alliance of ambition, not affection. But Caesar didn't need love. He needed time. Time to climb, to prepare, to wait until the Republic forgot what it once was and started to believe in what he could make it become. He was no longer the boy, no longer the outlaw. He was the rising storm, the one who smiled while counting knives, the one who walked into rooms where old men whispered of law and left them silent, the one who stared down tradition and offered it a choice, move forward or be buried beneath his sandals. So who was Caesar in the beginning? He was Rome's mirror, its son, its student, its shadow. He learned not just how to win, but how to wait, how to bleed without breaking, how to bend the rules so slowly that no one noticed they were already snapping. He was the child of nobility, but the heir of chaos. Born in a city already dying, raised in the ashes of men who ruled through terror, and forged in a fire that he himself would one day stoke into an empire. Before the throne, before the war, before the betrayal, there was a boy, a bloodline, and a whisper. Rome didn't make Caesar. Caesar made Rome remember what it meant to be conquered, not by foreigners, not by barbarians, but by one of its own. The boy never wanted to serve. He wanted to reign. And he never forgot the moment Sulla told him to kneel. Because from that moment on, Caesar knew the truth. Rome didn't belong to the Senate. It didn't belong to tradition. It didn't even belong to the gods. It belonged to the one who had the vision to take it. And he was coming for it, slowly, silently, unstoppably. He didn't return to Rome quietly. He returned like smoke, visible, suffocating, impossible to grasp. The kind of man who filled rooms before he entered them. The kind of voice that didn't echo, it thundered. Caesar came back not as a prodigal son, but as a storm wrapped in silk, fire behind his eyes, and ambition in every carefully chosen word. He wasn't there to rejoin Rome. He was there to remake it, and the city, groaning under the weight of debt, corruption, and senatorial rot, didn't know whether to cheer or run. The temples still stood, the laws were still chiseled into marble, but something ancient had shifted, a scent in the air, like blood on bronze. Caesar was home, and nothing would ever be the same again. Rome was sick, not from plague, but from paralysis. The Senate, bloated, brittle, arrogant, sat atop the city like a dying god, blind to its own decay. Old men in togas clung to their privileges with wrinkled fists, whispering of virtue while their hands counted bribes. The Republic had rules, sure, but those rules were weapons now, bent and broken by the very men who claimed to defend them. Elections were farces. Trials were theatre. Justice was a coin tossed by patricians in candlelit rooms. Caesar didn't rail against this world. He studied it, memorized every crack in its foundations, and then he started driving wedges into those cracks, slowly, carefully, with the grace of a surgeon and the patience of a god. He began with words, not swords, not threats, words. He spoke in the forum like a man possessed, his voice a force of nature that drew crowds like gravity. He didn't talk like a senator. He talked like a prophet, dipped in poetry and menace. Every speech was a performance, every pause a trap. He told the people what they already felt, that the elite were leeches, that the Republic had lost its soul, that the future could be taken back, but only if they followed someone who truly understood their hunger. He didn't promise peace. He promised glory. And Rome, starved of greatness, listened. But speeches alone don't shake empires. Caesar needed fuel, money, offices, influence. So he played the game like no one before him. He borrowed astronomical sums, enough to cripple lesser men. Debts that would have crushed his reputation if he hadn't used them as weapons. He bought land for veterans, games for the masses, and silence from rivals. And he did it all with a smile. Every denarius spent was an investment in his myth. He wasn't buying votes. He was building a cult. Allies came next, not friends. Caesar didn't have friends. He had uses. He formed the first triumvirate with Crassus, who could buy senators faster than they could count, and Pompey, the war hero adored by the army but naive enough to believe he could control Caesar. Together they formed a shadow government behind the crumbling facade of the Republic. Caesar didn't just climb the ladder, he lit it on fire behind him. He became consul, not through consensus, but through calculated chaos. And once he had power, he didn't wield it gently. He passed laws by force, guarded by mobs, flanked by loyalists. Opposition was drowned out, sometimes in words, sometimes in blood. The old elite watched in horror. They called him a tyrant, a demagogue, a cancer. But they couldn't stop him, because while they debated, he moved. While they appealed to tradition, he appealed to survival. He made politics visceral, personal, dangerous. The masses didn't just vote for Caesar. They fought for him. They guarded his podiums, shouted down his critics, flooded the streets like an army without armor. His power wasn't built in the Senate. It was built in the gutters, the taverns, the marketplaces where real Rome lived. He made them believe that if he rose, they rose. If he fell, they would be buried with him. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. It was the birth of a populist empire in everything but name. And still, he smiled. Still, he pardoned his enemies in public while sharpening blades in private. He played the generous reformer, doling out bread and land, even as he dismantled the balance of power brick by brick. He wasn't taking Rome by force. He was letting Rome hand itself to him on a platter of desperation and applause. And the senators, those aging architects of a dying dream, didn't realize they'd already lost until it was too late. Caesar didn't need an army in armor. He had an army of mouths, of ears, of hearts. He had veterans who owed him land, citizens who owed him bread, slaves who whispered his name in alleys like a prayer. He had the poets, the scribes, the rabble-rousers who spread his message like wildfire. And he had something even more dangerous: momentum. He was the future wrapped in the illusion of tradition, the firebrand who wore the toga, better than the fossils who once ruled the forum. Every decree, every festival, every public spectacle was another nail in the coffin of the old order. But Caesar didn't just build a movement. He became a myth, the man who could dine with plebeians in the morning and outmaneuver patricians by night, the man who loved Rome more than its laws, who sacrificed wealth for glory, comfort for conquest, allies for legacy. He wasn't just a threat to the elite. He was their replacement. They tried to smear him, accused him of ambition, of vanity, of sedition. But Caesar didn't deny it. He embraced it. He made ambition look noble, made power look earned, made control look like mercy. And while they sputtered in horror, while they invoked the ancestors and the sacred unwritten rules, Caesar kept climbing, higher, louder, faster, until Rome was no longer a republic. It was a reflection of him. He didn't conquer with legions, not yet. He conquered with stories, with favors owed and futures promised, with games that made peasants feel like kings and laws that made the powerful feel like prey. He was building something larger than himself, yet anchored entirely to his name. Caesar wasn't campaigning for office. He was orchestrating a takeover, and the citizens cheered him all the way up the marble steps. And through it all, the elite could only watch as their grip slipped, their relevance faded, and their republic was devoured by the very voice they underestimated. Because Caesar didn't just win power, he made power popular. He painted tyranny in civic colors. He made it feel like salvation. The climb wasn't a sprint. It was a slow, strategic strangling of the world that raised him. And when the Senate finally realized they were losing the fight, Caesar had already won it. Because he never needed their permission, just their fear. And he had it, in abundance. The boy was gone, the exile forgotten. The speeches were now weapons, the people now shields, the republic now rubble. In its place stood a man who had taken everything Rome had to offer and turned it into a ladder made of blood, oratory, and bribes. Caesar didn't just climb to the top. He rebuilt the top around himself, and the city that once spat him out now knelt at his feet, whispering his name, not with suspicion, but with awe. There was no ceremony, no parade, no marble inscription to mark its birth. Just a handshake behind closed doors, three men who should have despised each other, agreeing, without honor, without faith, without permanence, to twist the world together. It wasn't a pact. It was a gamble. It wasn't an alliance. It was a fuse. The first triumvirate wasn't carved into Rome's sacred records because it wasn't meant to be remembered. It was meant to be used. 3 names, 3 egos, 3 fires hungry for air. Gaius Julius Caesar, Pompey Magnus, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. One was adored by the legions. One owned the city in gold, and one had the vision to set it all aflame. They didn't trust each other. They didn't need to. They trusted what they hated more: the men who sat in the Senate, pretending the Republic still breathed. And together, these 3 carved up the corpse. Rome was never meant to be ruled like this. It had laws, precedents, traditions that stretched back to kings they'd killed and tyrants they'd exiled. But laws are only strong if people fear them. And Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had lost their fear. They were bigger than the Senate, bigger than Rome. They knew the truth that every dictator eventually discovers. When power is divided by law, it can be multiplied by conspiracy. So they met in secret, not because they were weak, but because they were too strong to be seen together without tearing the mask off the Republic. They didn't unite out of friendship. They united because alone, each of them could be stopped. Together, they were inevitable. Pompey was the war god, the darling of Rome's veterans, the general who had marched farther, conquered faster, and returned with more glory than anyone since Alexander. But Pompey was not a thinker. He was muscle-bound in pride. He had fame, but no finesse. He could crush enemies in battle, but was helpless in the Senate's maze of lies and loopholes. The aristocrats flattered him and blocked him in the same breath. His soldiers worshipped him, but his ambitions needed a political architect. He had the steel. He needed the script. Crassus, on the other hand, didn't bleed. He banked. The richest man in Rome, and perhaps the most cynical, Crassus had built his fortune on bribes, fires, slaves, and the quiet collapse of others. Where Pompey charged into battle, Crassus waited at the sidelines with a calculator. He bought debts, bought favors, bought silence. He owned entire neighborhoods, entire factions, entire senators. But money couldn't buy public love. Crassus was feared, but never adored. He wanted more than wealth. He wanted legacy. And for that, he needed war. He needed something, someone that could make his name unforgettable. He needed a partner who could turn gold into myth. And Caesar was the glue, the fire, the whisper that made this nightmare possible. He was the youngest, the boldest, the most dangerous. He had charm to match Crassus's cunning, and military flair to match Pompey's prestige. But more importantly, Caesar saw what the other two couldn't, that Rome wasn't just rotting, it was ready for someone to take it. Not by storm, but by shadow. He knew the Senate feared him. He knew they hated Pompey. He knew they envied Crassus. So he took that hatred and turned it into leverage. He promised Crassus the chance to shape policy, to pull strings from behind the curtain. He promised Pompey land for his troops, validation for his victories. And in return, they gave Caesar what he needed most: legitimacy, protection, funding. With their names behind him, he could bulldoze his enemies. With their power behind him, he could rise faster than Rome could react. It worked. It worked better than any of them imagined. Together they dominated elections, crushed opposition, passed laws through sheer intimidation. Caesar became consul, not because the Senate approved, but because no one dared stop him. Pompey got his land bills. Crassus got tax relief, for his allies in the east. Everyone got what they wanted. On paper, it looked like balance. In reality, it was a three-headed beast tearing through the foundations of the Republic. They were fire, oil, and ambition, moving in sync, but burning hotter with every success. But the thing about power is this: it doesn't share well. And the thing about men like these is this: they don't forget slights, they don't forgive insults, and they certainly don't fade quietly into the background. Crassus watched Pompey, soaking in glory, and seethed. Pompey watched Caesar's star rising and panicked. Caesar watched them both and smiled. He wasn't in this for balance. He was in it for leverage. The more they fought, the more room he had to climb. Every rift between his partners was a step closer to singular rule, and those rifts were growing. Pompey's jealousy bloomed like mold in a locked room. He saw the crowds cheer Caesar's name, saw the graffiti that called for Caesar's return from Gaul, saw the Senate start to shift their fear from him to the younger man with dirt on his boots and thunder in his speeches. Pompey had once been Rome's brightest star. Now he was orbiting Caesar's shadow. And Crassus, desperate to prove his worth in war, marched off to Parthia with dreams of conquest. He didn't return. His body was never brought back. His head was used as a prop in a foreign king's theatre. The pact was broken, not by betrayal, but by death. With Crassus gone, the balance was gone. The glue melted, the shadows cleared, and what remained was exactly what Caesar had seen all along: a reckoning. The triumvirate had been a pact with no future, just borrowed time. A burning fuse coiled around three throats, and now it had snapped. Pompey turned on Caesar. The Senate followed him. War was inevitable. But it hadn't started with legions. It started here, with a secret deal, made in a whisper, born in ambition, destined for blood. The first triumvirate wasn't just a political alliance. It was a prophecy that when power is divided among giants, it does not settle, it explodes. Caesar knew it. Pompey felt it. Crassus never lived to see it. But Rome would learn. Because betrayal in this world isn't a crime. It's a consequence. And alliances made without honor are always paid for in swords. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't even war. Not in the way civilized men understood it. Gaul was a crucible. A slow, grinding, brutal, magnificent bloodbath stretched across forests, rivers, mountains, and decades of tribal defiance. It was where the map of Rome began to swallow Europe, and where a man named Gaius Julius Caesar began to dissolve into myth. Not with a crown, not with a throne, but with the scream of horses, the crack of bone, and the silence of 1,000 camps soaked in mud, blood, and prophecy. What began as a political maneuver ended as the most theatrical slaughter Rome had ever seen. Gaul didn't just elevate Caesar. It forged him in fire and death. It stripped him of humanity and sculpted him into something more dangerous. Not mortal, not divine, but legendary. The Senate didn't send him to conquer. They sent him to disappear, to distract him, to contain him. Gaul was supposed to be a wilderness of minor skirmishes, tribal squabbles, and diplomatic headaches. But Caesar saw something else. He saw a blank canvas, a place where his name could be written in rivers and mountains, a stage with no curtain, a battlefield with no limit. He had legions at his back, ambition in his bones, and the gnawing knowledge that time in politics was short and treacherous. But in war, in chaos, in glory, he could become permanent. The tribes of Gaul didn't stand a chance. Not because they were weak, not because they didn't fight, but because they didn't understand what they were fighting. Caesar wasn't just a general, he was a writer, a dramatist, a myth-maker in armor. Every battle was recorded, curated, polished, and delivered back to Rome like a serialized epic. The commentaries on the Gallic War weren't dry reports. They were propaganda masterpieces written in the third person like ancient scripture. Caesar defeated them. Caesar showed mercy. Caesar built a bridge in 10 days and crossed a river no Roman had dared touch. It wasn't just about winning. It was about crafting a legend with ink as much as with steel. But the victories were real, and they were monstrous. Cities burned, villages vanished, entire peoples were erased from memory. Gaul became a graveyard with milestones. One year, the Helvetii migration was halted, their tribe crushed. The next, the Belgae were shattered. Then the Veneti, their sails slashed, their people enslaved. Over and over the same rhythm: contact, diplomacy, resistance, annihilation. And through it all, Caesar painted himself as reluctant, forced to fight, a servant of Rome. But he wasn't. He was feeding the machine. Not just the Roman war engine, but his own mythos. He built bridges across impossible rivers. He marched troops through frozen terrain that broke lesser men. He outmaneuvered cavalry with infantry, broke sieges with engineering feats that made mountains feel small. He laid traps so elaborate they seemed divine. At Alesia, he didn't just besiege a city. He built walls to encircle the enemy, and then built another set of walls to defend from outside reinforcements. A city trapped within a trap. It was genius. It was madness. And it worked. Vercingetorix, the Gallic resistance leader who had united the tribes, surrendered not with a scream, but with a silent ride into camp, armor removed, head bowed. A performance, a submission, not just to Caesar, but to the myth of him. Rome read the reports and gasped, not just at the victories, but at the audacity. Here was a man who didn't ask permission, who didn't wait for the Senate, who didn't respect the bureaucracies that had raised him. He fought, he won, he wrote it down, and by the time they read it, the facts were irrelevant. He'd already moved on to the next conquest. He was always ahead of the story, which meant he controlled it. And the people, oh, the people, they adored him. His name was carved into walls, his face etched onto coins. The Senate murmured of limits, but the people whispered prayers. To them, he wasn't a man. He was momentum, Rome incarnate. To his soldiers, he was even more. He didn't command from tents. He fought beside them, ate their food, slept on the same frozen ground. When they marched, he marched. When they bled, he bled. He learned their names, knew their fears, shared their dirt. And in return, they didn't just obey. They worshipped. He turned legions into instruments of will, into machines driven by loyalty, not fear. They would die for him without question, and many did. Because when Caesar said, "Veni, vidi, vici," it wasn't just a boast, it was doctrine. He came, he saw, he conquered, and then he made sure the world never forgot it. But Gaul wasn't just conquest, it was cruelty. The numbers are staggering. Hundreds of thousands killed, millions enslaved, villages wiped clean from the earth, fields salted, survivors paraded in chains, children sold in bulk. Caesar didn't blink, not because he lacked a soul, but because he had already replaced it with destiny. To him, every corpse was another stone in the foundation of his future. Every scream another echo in the halls of history he was building for himself. And yet, he always had a reason, a justification. They attacked first. They broke treaties. They betrayed Rome. His violence always came dressed in the language of justice. That was the trick. That was the art. To the Gauls, he was a demon, a force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with. They called him a butcher, a devil, a storm with sandals. And they were right. He didn't conquer like other generals. He didn't build empires. He devoured them, transformed them, made them his. He didn't want Gaul because of resources. He wanted Gaul because of what it would make of him. And it did. When he crossed the Alps, he was a politician with a sword. When he crossed them again, he was something else, entirely. He had reshaped the map, redrawn the world, elevated himself beyond every rival. By the time he returned to Rome, his legend arrived ahead of him. Children recited his battles. Poets sang of his strategy. Commoners carved his name into wood and stone. Senators trembled, because now Caesar wasn't just a man who wanted power. He was a man who had earned it. Through brilliance, through brutality, through blood. Gaul was his masterpiece, not because it was clean or just or noble, but because it was unforgettable, because it was total. It didn't just win Caesar territory, it won him time, prestige, fear. And when the Senate looked up and saw him standing there, alive, victorious, adored, they realized too late that Gaul had done more than make him famous. It had made him inevitable, a god to his soldiers, a demon to his enemies, a myth to the people. And to the Senate, a reckoning. That was Gaul. That was Caesar. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a proper declaration. Just one step, one river, one moment that split time like a sword. The Rubicon wasn't wide. It wasn't deep. It wasn't supposed to matter. But when Caesar reached its banks, with his banner raised and his legion waiting behind him, everything, the laws, the republic, the centuries of tradition, froze. He looked at the water. Still, quiet, innocent. Then he stepped across, and the world broke in half. The die is cast. He said it not like a hero, not like a man hungry for power, but like someone who understood that the ghosts had already begun to howl. It wasn't bravado, it was resignation, because he knew exactly what it meant. The moment his sandal touched the far bank, there was no going back. Not to compromise, not to peace, not to the Republic as it was. The Rubicon wasn't a river. It was a point of no return. And when Caesar crossed it, he didn't just start a civil war. He declared that Rome itself was his to decide. The Senate called it treason. Pompey called it rebellion. The Optimates called it madness. But none of them could stop it, because it had already begun long before the river. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a lunge for power from a crazed general. This was a slow-burning fuse, lit years ago in Gaul, in the Forum, in the ashes of a broken republic where laws were tools and tradition was theatre. The Senate had begged Caesar to disband his army, to return as a private citizen, to kneel. But Caesar didn't kneel. He had given them victory, land, prestige, security. He had conquered a continent in their name. And now they wanted him stripped, tried, humiliated. He saw the trap, and he chose war, but not with fury, with precision, with calculation, with something colder than ambition, inevitability. Caesar didn't storm across Italy. He advanced like fate, slowly, relentlessly. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected. Senators fled. Pompey, the once unstoppable general, ran. Not because he was weak, but because he was smart. He saw what was coming. He knew what Caesar had become. Not a man chasing the Republic, but a man replacing it. Caesar didn't call it conquest. He called it restoration. He told the people he was saving Rome from corruption, from aristocratic decay, from the men who used liberty as a mask for greed. And the terrifying thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong. The Senate had become a playground for oligarchs. Justice was a coin flip. Elections were auctions. Rome needed order, and Caesar offered it. Not in words, in action, in strategy, in silence that made his enemies tremble. This wasn't a war of factions, it was a war of futures. On one side, Caesar with his legions, his charisma, his mythos. On the other, Pompey, the Senate, the lost flicker of a dying ideal. But the old world was tired. It couldn't inspire. It couldn't fight the way Caesar could, because Caesar was Rome, or at least the Rome people were beginning to believe in. A Rome that worked, that one, that fed, that ruled. The Republic was a memory. Caesar was a reality. And yet, this wasn't bloodless. Civil war cracked the world. Cities burned. Brothers turned. Friends killed each other in the dust of forgotten alliances. Battles raged from Spain to Greece, from the shores of Illyricum to the deserts of North Africa. Caesar chased Pompey across continents, not with vengeance, but with the cold hunger of someone reclaiming what he believed was already his. Every victory wasn't a triumph. It was a reminder. That resistance was futile, that history was being rewritten under his feet. But there was something else, too. Something darker. Caesar didn't relish the war. He won it like a man fulfilling prophecy. Efficient, reluctant, unstoppable. He pardoned enemies, welcomed defectors, spared cities. Not because he was merciful, but because he didn't fear them. His mercy wasn't forgiveness. It was dominance disguised as grace. He wanted a swift war, not for peace, but for power that didn't have to be contested again. And when Pompey finally fell, betrayed, murdered in Egypt, Caesar didn't celebrate. He wept, because he didn't want Pompey dead. He wanted him beaten, on his knees, alive, and watching as Caesar rebuilt the world. But by then it didn't matter. The Senate had scattered. The old guard was shattered. Caesar returned to Rome not as a victor, but as a vortex. He wasn't seeking approval. He was giving it, distributing offices like tokens, appointing magistrates, rewriting laws, calling himself dictator, not just in name, but in function. And yet there was no throne, no crown, just power, pure, unfiltered, undeniable. And so the question hung in the air, heavy, unspoken. Was this Caesar against Rome? Or Caesar as Rome? Had the Republic been betrayed? Or had it simply evolved into something more honest, more efficient, more dangerous? The answer didn't lie in parchment. It didn't lie in debate. It lay in that one step, that one river, that one moment when a man chose destiny over obedience, when he crossed not just water, but a line no one had dared cross for 400 years. That was the Rubicon. And once it was behind him, the world would never go back. Because when Caesar cast the die, he didn't just gamble with his life, he gambled with civilization, and won. They weren't always enemies. Once they shared toasts, shared triumphs, shared Rome between them like gods lounging over a map. Caesar and Pompey, Gaius and Gnaeus, the rising star and the already blazing sun. When the first triumvirate was born in whispered shadows, it was Caesar who looked to Pompey, not with envy, but with admiration. Pompey had what Caesar wanted: glory, command, the roar of legions behind him, and the love of Rome before him. And Pompey saw in Caesar something terrifyingly familiar. The spark of a younger him, but sharper, hungrier, and with eyes that didn't blink. Their bond wasn't forged in trust. It was forged in need, in ambition, in the cold arithmetic of power. They were never truly friends, but they pretended. For the public, for the Senate, for the illusion that Rome was still ruled by cooperation and not by deals made over blood-slick scrolls. Pompey married Caesar's daughter, Julia, young, radiant, political gold. She became the bridge between them, a woman holding together two titans with her name and her womb. But then she died, and with her, the bridge crumbled. Without Julia, there was no glue, just gravity. Caesar rising, Pompey falling, and Pompey, once adored by the legions, once the conqueror of the East, once the master of the Mediterranean, began to feel it. That shift, that slow erosion of prestige. The cheers growing louder for someone else. Caesar's victories in Gaul drowned out Pompey's past. And the Senate, desperate to stop Caesar, clutched at Pompey like a drowning man clutching a dagger. They offered him everything: command, loyalty, the chance to be the savior again. And Pompey, older now, more cautious, less beloved, took the bait. He aligned with Caesar's enemies, the optimates, the purists, the guardians of a republic they themselves had corrupted beyond recognition. And in doing so, he made the fatal choice to turn against the man who once lifted him up. Caesar saw it, understood it, and never forgave it. Because this wasn't just politics, this was betrayal with a familiar face. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it wasn't just a declaration of war, it was a declaration of heartbreak. He wasn't just marching on Rome, he was marching on Pompey, on the ghost of friendship, on the corpse of loyalty. And Pompey ran, not out of cowardice, but out of calculation. He didn't want a civil war in the streets. He wanted to regroup, to gather allies, to crush Caesar with numbers and legitimacy. But each city that fell to Caesar did so without resistance. The people opened their gates, the soldiers switched sides, and Pompey the Great, became Pompey the Hunted. They clashed across the Mediterranean: Spain, Greece, Macedonia. At Pharsalus, the two colossi finally met. One last chance for Pompey to reclaim his legacy, one final moment to turn back the tide. He had more men, more cavalry, a stronger position. But Caesar had something else: inevitability. His troops didn't just fight for orders. They fought for him. For the man who had slept beside them in the mud, who knew their names, who shared their food. The battle didn't last long. Pompey's army broke, his allies scattered, and Caesar stood on the field, victorious, not with joy, but with something closer to sorrow. Because deep down, some part of him still remembered. The toasts, the plans, Julia, the illusion that they might rule Rome together. But now Pompey was gone, fleeing to Egypt, and Caesar followed, not for war, but for closure, for the final act in a tragedy they had written together. But Egypt was no stage. It was a trap, a theater of cruelty wrapped in sun and sand. Pompey, thinking he would find refuge, found betrayal. The boy King Ptolemy, advised by men desperate to win Caesar's favor, decided to present him a gift, a severed head, in a box. When Caesar arrived and saw it, he did not smile. He wept. He turned away. Because this wasn't justice. This wasn't war. This was loss. This was the last remnant of what had been crushed under the weight of ambition. Pompey wasn't just defeated, he was discarded, forgotten, and even Caesar, crowned in victory, felt the cold. And then came Cleopatra, the queen in exile, the seduction of intellect, of power, of potential. Caesar, still reeling from betrayal, found in her not just beauty, but a mirror. Someone who understood what it meant to rule alone, to scheme in corridors lined with daggers, to sleep under ceilings painted with prophecy and threat. Together, they were fire and silk. Her throne was secured with his help, his legacy extended through her son. But even this alliance was not salvation. It was a reprieve, because Caesar had won, but he had also lost. The Senate now trembled. The enemies were silenced. The Republic was his in all but name, yet he was alone. Crassus, gone. Pompey, murdered. Julia, dead. The triumvirate, ashes. The city he had conquered was now a cage of expectation, and power, once sweet, now tasted like rot. He gave Rome peace. He gave it food, reforms, calendars, order, but not joy, not trust. The streets cheered, the elite seethed, and Caesar walked among them like a god half-formed, feared, worshipped, hated, because power poisons. But loneliness kills. He had everything, and no one. Not really. No equals, no partners, no Pompey. Only shadows, only whispers, only knives being sharpened behind marble columns. Caesar the ruler, Caesar the god, Caesar the man who looked back across a river of blood and saw not glory, but ghosts. And somewhere, in the silence of the Egyptian coast, a box still floated. A severed head, a memory of the friend he had once called brother. A reminder that the climb to power is never straight. It is soaked in irony, paved with broken oaths, and crowned not in laurels but in solitude. There was no golden diadem, no velvet throne, no divine thunder cracking open the sky to mark his coronation. And yet, when Caesar walked through Rome in the final months of his life, the city did not see a consul. It did not see a reformer. It saw something else entirely. It saw a king, and in Rome, that was the most dangerous thing a man could be. He didn't wear the title. He didn't need to. Titles were for men who asked permission. Caesar had passed that point years ago. What he held now was not power given, but power accepted. By the people, by the legions, by the world itself. Dictator for life. It sounded official, almost bureaucratic. But behind the words was the truth that Rome had feared for centuries. The Republic was dead, and Caesar was the man who had buried it with a smile and a signature. It hadn't started that way. When he returned from Gaul, flushed with conquest, dripping in glory, he played the role of the reluctant warrior. He asked the Senate for compromise, for dignity, for peace. They answered with betrayal, accusations, legal traps, ultimatums. So he crossed the Rubicon, took the city, took the government, and then, instead of destroying it, he rewrote it. At first it was reform, land for veterans, grain for the poor, colonies for the homeless, debts forgiven, calendars fixed, corruption attacked. The people cheered. The elite gritted their teeth. But Caesar moved quickly, too quickly. Magistrates were appointed, not elected. Senators were increased in number and diluted in power. Traditional offices were repurposed into tools of control. Tribunes, once the voice of the common man, now served as instruments of imperial authority. The Republic still wore its old face, but its heartbeat had changed. He did it with law, with ink, with decrees passed through assemblies filled with loyalists. He gave Rome order. But it was his order, efficient, ruthless, predictable. Caesar was the architect and the executor, the judge and the enforcer. No motion moved without him. No law passed outside his shadow. He didn't destroy the Senate. He domesticated it, turned it from a roaring beast into a house pet, fed and praised but leashed. He wore the laurel wreath permanently now, not just as a token of military triumph, but as a symbol of perpetual victory. His statue stood among the gods. His image was stamped on coins, something no living Roman had ever dared. The Forum, once a cacophony of voices, now echoed with one. He sat above the Curia, higher than the rest. Not metaphorically, literally. His chair was elevated, his presence inescapable. And the people, they loved him. Or at least they loved what he gave them. Games, grain, spectacle, security. The civil wars were over. The streets were clean. The markets full. For a population raised on chaos, Caesar was peace incarnate. He didn't need fear to rule. He ruled with momentum, the kind of momentum that makes resistance feel pointless. But there was a crack, a fracture too small for the crowd to see. But the senators felt it. They watched their roles shrink, their rituals emptied. They watched the Republic, their Republic, become a stage set for Caesar's performance. They saw what he was becoming. Not just a man, not even a monarch, but a myth in the making. And that terrified them more than any army ever could. Because in Rome, power was supposed to end. Terms were supposed to expire. Leaders were supposed to step down. That was the sacred lie that kept the Republic alive. Caesar refused, not out of greed, not out of vanity, but out of belief. He believed he was the answer, the stabilizer, the solution to centuries of dysfunction. And maybe he was. But Rome wasn't built on results. It was built on ritual. And Caesar broke the ritual. He brushed against monarchy too many times, took too many honors, accepted too many divine comparisons. The crown was offered, twice, maybe 3 times. He refused it publicly, dramatically. But even that refusal was dangerous, because the act itself broke something ancient. A Roman should never have to refuse a crown. A Roman should never be close enough to touch one. The rumors began to grow. That he would declare himself king, that he would move the capital to Alexandria, that he would marry Cleopatra and start a dynasty, that he would erase the Senate entirely and rule as pharaoh in all but name. None of it was confirmed. All of it was feared. And fear is the true architect of assassination. The conspiracy wasn't a mob. It was a mirror, a circle of men who had once cheered for him, served him. Some of them owed him their careers. Some owed him their lives. But what they feared most was that they owed him their future. They called themselves liberators, patriots, guardians of the old ways. But they weren't killing a tyrant. They were killing the proof that the Republic had already died. And so they plotted. Not in the dark, but in the corridors of power. Not with soldiers, but with knives hidden under togas. They knew they couldn't beat him in the Forum. They couldn't outvote him, outmaneuver him, outshine him. So they chose blood. Not war, not revolution. Theatre. The Ides of March, a meeting of the Senate, a room with no guards. Caesar walked in unarmed. Not because he was careless, but because he believed the myth, believed that he was untouchable, that he was necessary, that Rome could not survive without him. And in a way he was right. They struck him 23 times. They didn't chant, they didn't roar, they didn't even run. They stood in silence as history bled at their feet. The last breath of the Republic was not a cry, it was a gasp, because in killing Caesar, They didn't restore the Republic. They shattered the illusion that it could be saved. He died with his eyes open, and Rome never closed them again. Crown or no crown, Caesar had already become king. Not by title, but by truth. He ruled with order, built with ambition, and fell to the only thing that could kill a god: belief. Because the Republic didn't die when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It died when he offered stability, and the people chose it over tradition. It died when senators realized their speeches meant nothing. It died when Rome looked at Caesar and saw its future, and then stabbed it in the back, appointed for life, feared for longer, a king without a crown, a ruler without an equal, a man who gave Rome what it needed and paid for it with everything he had. Was that the final sin, or the final sacrifice? The answer still bleeds in marble. She arrived not with an army, but with a legend, draped in linen and honeyed rumor, carried across the Nile and into the darkest, most intimate chambers of Roman power. Cleopatra was not just a queen, she was an answer. To questions no one dared speak aloud, questions about empire, about legacy, about love, and about what a man like Caesar truly feared. She did not walk into his world, she ensnared it. Not by seduction, but by strategy. She was Egypt wrapped in perfume and prophecy, a crown veiled in silk and venom. And when she met Caesar, the world held its breath, not out of admiration, but anticipation. Because this wasn't a romance, it was an earthquake. They met in a palace full of tension and treachery. Egypt was fracturing, a once mighty kingdom now bleeding power from a dozen open wounds. Cleopatra was young, deposed, betrayed by her own brother. Her court was a viper pit, and the throne had slipped from her grasp. But Caesar, fresh from victory, mourning Pompey, staring into the mouth of the East, arrived not as a guest, but as a verdict. Rome had come, and Egypt had to choose, submission or seduction. She chose both. She had herself rolled into a carpet, yes, perhaps a myth, perhaps a gesture, and unrolled before Caesar like a secret the desert had been keeping. He saw her not as a girl, not even as a queen, but as an equal. She didn't beg. She didn't flatter. She offered alliance, intrigue, the shimmer of something Rome did not yet possess. Caesar was a man who had crossed rivers, conquered nations, broken republics. But here was something he couldn't crush. A woman whose kingdom came with gods older than Jupiter, rituals stranger than augury, and wealth deeper than any Roman vault. Was it love? Was it lust? Was it politics wearing a perfume of affection? The answer, as always, lies somewhere between scandal and strategy. They were fire and oil, dangerous apart, explosive together. Cleopatra gave him not just a bed, but a throne to lean against. She restored herself with Caesar's help, claimed her crown again, and in return gave him something no other woman could: a dynasty. Caesarion. The child. The whisper turned scream. A son born not in secret, but in myth. To the Romans it was blasphemy. Caesar had no legitimate heir, no child of Roman blood. And now there was talk of a boy born under the Egyptian sun, cradled by Cleopatra, whose veins held not just royal Nile, but Julian fire. Rome whispered. And then it shouted. Senators scoffed. Gossip bloomed in the forum like plague. Could it be true? Would Caesar name him heir? Would Rome, eternal, unbroken, be passed down through a foreign queen and a half-Egyptian child? He never answered. Not clearly, not publicly. Caesar was too careful, too shrewd. But he didn't deny it. He didn't send Cleopatra away. He didn't hide the boy. He brought her to Rome, not for a visit, not as a guest, as a symbol, as a statement. She came gilded in gold and suspicion, draped in Eastern silk, bearing not just herself, but an empire of implications. She did not enter quietly. She entered as if Rome itself was beneath her feet. The people stared. The women gossiped. The Senate seethed. Cleopatra had dared to breathe the same Roman air as their wives. She strolled through the gardens of Caesar's villa like a queen on her own soil. She watched the games. She hosted banquets. She stood in Caesar's orbit like a second son. Not a mistress, not a guest, a rival. The most powerful woman in the Mediterranean was no longer in Alexandria. She was here, and Rome didn't know what to do with her. Did Caesar love her? Perhaps. Or perhaps he loved what she represented. Continuity. Empire. A vision not bound by marble columns or ancestral rites. Cleopatra was a queen who ruled like a man, spoke like a poet, planned like a general. She didn't giggle or blush. She spoke of gods and taxes, of grain shipments and border conflicts. She wasn't decoration. She was co-strategy. Where Roman wives bore sons and held their tongues, Cleopatra offered opinions and demanded sovereignty. And that was the scandal. Not the child, not the affair, but the fact that Caesar had found a mind to match his own. A woman who wouldn't simply lie beside him, but rule beside him, if he let her. Rome couldn't tolerate it. Rome could barely tolerate Caesar himself. Their private life became public spectacle. Every glance became commentary. Every decision Caesar made was dissected for traces of Cleopatra's influence. Did she push him to take more power? Did she whisper monarchy into his ear at night? Did she urge him to name Caesarion his heir? No one could prove it, but no one could ignore it. And in the end, it didn't matter, because she had done the one thing no other woman had ever managed. She made Caesar vulnerable. Not in war, not in politics, but in emotion. She gave him a son, a future, a temptation to build something beyond himself. He had crushed the Republic. He had rebuilt Rome. But Cleopatra made him consider what came after, what he would leave behind. And that may have been his final sin. Because power, for all its cruelty, is easier to wield alone. Caesar had spent his life surrounded by enemies, by soldiers, by senators, all of them temporary, all of them replaceable. But Cleopatra, she couldn't be replaced. She meant something. And meaning is dangerous. Meaning makes gods bleed. It makes kings hesitate. When the knives finally fell, when the ordees of March came like a drumbeat of betrayal, Cleopatra was not there. But her shadow was. Her child was. Her future was. And the men who stabbed Caesar weren't just killing a dictator. They were killing the idea that the world could belong to something new. Something born of Rome and Egypt, of East and West, of empire and myth. After his death, Cleopatra fled, took Caesarion, took her secrets, returned to the Nile where the gods still listened. But she didn't fade. She became larger, a figure of fascination, of rage, of obsession. To some, a witch, to others, a goddess. To history, a riddle wrapped in silk and smoke. Did she love him or use him? Was she the mother of an heir or the mother of ambition itself? The truth, like the Nile, wins and deepens. But this much is certain. Caesar conquered nations. Cleopatra conquered him, not with armies, not with gold, with presence, with purpose, with the kind of myth that lives longer than marble and echoes louder than any Senate scream. Love, scandal, empire, and a child watching from the shadows, with the blood of a god in his veins and the weight of 2 worlds on his name. The knives weren't sharpened in alleys. They didn't glint in the hands of thieves or flicker in the back rooms of taverns. They were forged in the Senate, polished with rhetoric, tempered with fear, hidden behind togas. The men who held them were not assassins. They were aristocrats, patriots, senators, friends. They didn't plot in darkness. They plotted in marble corridors, beneath frescoed ceilings, surrounded by busts of dead ancestors whose eyes watched in silent judgment. The conspiracy to kill Julius Caesar wasn't born in rage. It was born in the memory of a republic already dead, kept alive only by the rituals of the men who now sharpened their blades on the bones of tradition. It began not with violence, but with whispers. A glance held too long, a pause after a vote, a word spoken at the wrong time in the wrong room. Caesar was dictator for life. The phrase was still new, still echoing, the ink barely dry. And yet it felt ancient already, like a crown without the ceremony. He had taken everything. The Senate still met, but it was a theatre. The laws still passed, but they were his. The people still shouted his name, but they no longer whispered anyone else's. Rome still breathed, but it did so under his lungs. And that, for some, was unbearable. Cassius was the flame, Brutus the fuel, one a lifelong cynic, the other a reluctant idealist. Cassius hated Caesar for his power. Brutus hated himself for loving the man who held it. They were not villains. They were not heroes. They were the last desperate gasp of an order, too proud to admit it had failed. Cassius whispered of monarchy, of tyranny, of how Caesar's image on coins was not honor, but heresy, of how the laurel wreath was becoming too tight, too permanent, of how one man's shadow had begun to stretch across the entire world. Brutus resisted, not because he disagreed, but because he remembered. He remembered Caesar's kindness, his brilliance, his charm, the way he spoke to crowds like a god and to friends like a brother. Brutus was Caesar's protege, his confidant, almost a son. But he was also the descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had driven out the last king of Rome. His name was a banner, a warning, a curse, and now history was calling, not gently, but with knives. The omens came like waves before a storm, a soothsayer in the crowd. Beware the Ides of March. Dreams soaked in blood, statues weeping, animals refusing to be sacrificed, lightning splitting the sky in shapes no augur could interpret. Even Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, begged him not to go to the Senate that day. She dreamed he would die there. She woke trembling, pleading, but Caesar laughed, or perhaps he didn't. Perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps he knew, because Caesar was not blind. He felt it, the air thickening, the silence before a crack, the way his allies had begun to avoid his eyes, the way Brutus smiled, too briefly. He had survived civil wars, betrayals, invasions, ambushes. He knew the scent of danger. But this was different. This was intimate, personal. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. And still, he went. Not because he was brave, not because he was arrogant, but because he understood one truth better than anyone else, alive. You do not dodge destiny. You invite it. You don't flee from history. You walk into it. Caesar didn't rule because he clung to power. He ruled because he embodied inevitability, and he knew that some stories can only end in blood. The Ides of March, the Senate, a morning heavy with ceremony. Caesar entered without guards, not because he was careless, but because to enter with guards would be to admit fear, and fear was not a language Caesar spoke. The Senate chamber, marble and silence, senators rising to greet him, too many rising, too many steps forward, the ring tightening, the circle closing. The first strike didn't kill him. It was a wound, a question, a signal. Then the others followed. 23 times they stabbed, not in rage, but in ritual. This was not a murder. It was a sacrifice, an offering to the Republic's ghost. They struck not to kill Caesar the man, but to slay Caesar the symbol, to cut down the idea that one man could eclipse the Republic and survive. And yet, he didn't scream, he did not fight. He looked at each of them, at the men he had elevated, at the men he had trusted, at Brutus. Et tu, Brute. Not a question, not even an accusation, a resignation, a confirmation, a man watching the last thread of belief snap. Not belief in Rome, not in power, but in loyalty, in love, in the fragile idea that anything built on blood could end in anything else. He fell beneath Pompey's statue. Another irony, placed there not by fate, but by memory. The man who had once been his friend, his rival, his ghost. Caesar died at the feet of the very man who had warned him what ambition cost. And the conspirators? They stepped back, swords dripping, faces pale. The silence was not triumph, it was terror. There was no cheer, no applause, only echoes, because in that moment they realized they had not saved the Republic. They had killed the only man who could pretend it still lived. Rome didn't erupt, it recoiled. The people did not praise the assassins, they mourned Caesar. They lit fires, carried his body, wept in the streets. Mark Antony spoke, not just to defend Caesar, but to bury the assassins in the flood of public grief. The Senate fractured, the city cracked, civil war bloomed again. Brutus fled, Cassius fled. They died not as saviors but as fugitives. The Republic they fought for never returned. It couldn't, because Caesar had already replaced it with something more efficient, more terrible, more eternal. An empire, a name, a myth. The Ides of March became more than a date. It became a warning that power, once touched, stains everything. That betrayal doesn't always purify. It sometimes completes the very story it tries to end. That the knife you raise for freedom might instead carve the path for a crown, a whisper that still haunts marble. Because in the end, Caesar was not just murdered, he was transformed. There were no cheers, no triumphs, no senators bathing in applause. When the knives were cleaned and the blood scrubbed from the marble, there was only silence. Not peace, silence. A silence so thick it swallowed the very walls of the Curia. Julius Caesar, the man who had conquered Gaul, crushed Pompey, stared down the Senate, and wrapped the Republic around his will, now lay cold. And Rome didn't celebrate. It trembled. Because something had gone horribly wrong. The tyrant was dead, but the Republic wasn't reborn. It was bleeding, gasping, lost. The senators had expected a roar of approval. They thought the people would rally, that the streets would erupt in joyous cries, that the name Brutus would become a hymn, and Cassius a savior. Instead, they met faces blank with shock. Murmurs. Then murmurs gave way to questions, and the questions twisted into rage. Who gave you the right? Who appointed you the gods of Rome? Caesar was dead, but he was still in the streets, still in their memories, still in their bellies and homes and dreams. He had given them land, food, safety. He had spoken to them as if their voices mattered. The Republic, in all its pomp and marble, had given them lectures and taxes. Caesar had given them Rome. The funeral was supposed to be quiet, controlled, a noble affair for a noble death. But nothing about Caesar's death was noble, and nothing about what came next was quiet. Mark Antony, consul, soldier, friend, rose to speak, and the world cracked open. It wasn't just a speech, it was a storm. A fire whispered through teeth and shouted through tears. He didn't name names. Not at first. He didn't need to. He held Caesar's blooded toga aloft and let the silence do the work. He read the will. The will. Caesar's final move, his last stroke of genius, delivered from beyond the grave like a general commanding even in death. To the people, land, money, generosity beyond anything the Senate had ever offered. Each citizen, even the poorest, named in his will. He remembered them. He loved them. Even as he bled to death, he thought of them. And the Senate, the murderers, they had offered nothing but steel. The crowd turned, not slowly, not thoughtfully. Instantly, they surged, cried, tore their clothes, carried Caesar's body through the streets, weeping as though a god had fallen. They piled wood for a pyre not in the forum, but wherever their hands could build it. They burned him in the center of the city, without permission, without order, and from those flames rose a cry that would not be extinguished, not with reason, not with tradition, not even with blood. Antony didn't stop them. He led them, carefully, strategically. Because Mark Antony didn't just grieve Caesar, he understood him. He understood power. And now, power was no longer in the Senate. It was in the streets. Brutus and Cassius watched it all unravel, watched their hope for a renewed republic dissolve under the weight of a corpse. They had believed that by killing the man, they could kill the momentum, kill the myth. They had miscalculated. Caesar's death didn't weaken him. It deified him. It purified him. He became more than mortal, more than ruler. He became a martyr. The Senate tried to reassert control. They tried to calm the city, restore order. But order no longer lived in the Curia. It marched now, cloaked in grief and rage, behind Antony, behind Caesar's name, behind the idea that one man could give Rome what centuries of senators had failed to deliver. Then came Octavian, a boy by some reckonings, a shadow, Caesar's adopted heir, named in the will, called son. He returned to Rome not with legions, but with legitimacy, and in a world where law had become theatre, legitimacy was the only script that mattered. Octavian joined with Antony, not out of love, but out of necessity. Together they hunted down the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, the so-called liberators. They died not on the steps of triumph, but on foreign fields, broken, hunted, betrayed by the very republic they thought they had saved. The republic didn't return, not for a moment, not in whisper, not even in pretense. What returned was war, chaos, years of retribution, broken alliances, and shifting loyalties. And through it all, Caesar's shadow loomed. His name became more powerful than any living man. His calendar was adopted, his reforms upheld, his statues restored. He was gone, but he had never been more present. And then, with time, with blood, with cleverness and silence, and the slow grinding wheel of inevitability, Octavian became Augustus, not consul, not general. Princeps, first citizen, emperor. But even as the empire rose, everyone knew whose blueprint it followed. Caesar's, whose vision it realized. Caesar's, whose death had made it possible. Caesar's, that's the irony. The dark, beautiful tragedy. The men who killed him did so to prevent a king, and instead they paved the road for an empire. They thought his blood would cleanse Rome. Instead, it fertilized something far larger, far more enduring, and far more dangerous. Because Caesar, in death, became invincible, not in body, but in idea. And an idea is harder to kill than any man. He had rewritten the world, not with scrolls, not even with swords, but with himself, with presence, with a life so vast, so bold, that the only way to stop it was to end it. And even then, it didn't end. It spread. Caesar the general, Caesar the conqueror, Caesar the reformer, but above all, Caesar the martyr. Killed not by his enemies, but by his believers. Men who thought they were saving a dream, only to wake in a nightmare of their own making. The Republic ended, not with war, but with mourning. Not with a coup, but with a funeral. A man died. A myth was born. And Rome, the eternal city, entered a new age, an imperial age, one born not from ambition, but from grief. One in which the name Caesar would no longer belong to a man. It would become a title, a throne, a legacy stained in blood, but polished in fire. The people mourned, the Senate trembled, and the world changed forever. They still argue about him, still shout across centuries, across scrolls and Senate floors, across marble and parchment and glowing screens. Who was he, really? A liberator? A traitor? A tyrant with a messiah complex? A savior born too soon? The truth is, Julius Caesar didn't live a life. He lived a paradox. He did not leave behind a clear legacy. He left behind a battlefield of interpretations. His footsteps carved paths in stone, but the dust never settled. Even now, 2,000 years after the blade fell, we still walk in the echo of his ambition. To the people, he was a god wrapped in flesh. The man who brought them land, grain, security, and purpose. He fed them when the Senate ignored them. He gave them games when the elite gave them silence. He spoke their language, laughed their laughter, wore their hopes like armor. When he walked the streets of Rome, the mob didn't see a man. They saw a future. They didn't care about tradition or balance of power or the sanctity of the Republic. They cared about now. And Caesar delivered. But to the aristocrats, the optimates, the old guard choking on their own grandeur, he was a monster. Not because he was cruel, because he was effective. He took the tools of the Republic and used them better than anyone else. He didn't abolish laws, he manipulated them. He didn't destroy offices, he mastered them. Every step up the cursus honorum, every office won, every title granted, it was all legal. And that's what terrified them. He didn't break the system. He revealed how broken it already was. To the soldiers, he was legend incarnate. He marched beside them, bled with them, fought like one of them. They loved him, not because he ordered them, but because he understood them. He remembered names, shared meals, endured winters. And when he promised land, he delivered. When he asked for loyalty, he earned it. To them, he wasn't just a general. He was a father, a protector, a destiny in human form. His legions didn't fight for Rome. They fought as Caesar's Rome. They didn't shout for the Senate. They shouted for Caesar. To the historians, he is a riddle still bleeding, a man of contradictions, ruthless but merciful, vain but pragmatic, romantic but calculating. He wept at the death of Pompey, but outmaneuvered him to the grave. He loved Cleopatra, but never named Caesarian heir. He forgave enemies while preparing their replacements. He refused the crown in public, yet took every honor of a king behind the curtain. He was obsessed with control and addicted to appearances. He believed in fate, but sculpted it with his own hands. He claimed to be saving the Republic, but buried it under reforms so sweeping they became a new regime. He made himself the exception to every rule, and made the people believe that was justice. And to the men who murdered him, he was a mirror. He reflected everything they feared and everything they had failed to become. Brutus, with his ancestral weight. Cassius, with his ideological fire. They didn't kill Caesar out of hatred. They killed him out of panic. They saw in him the death of their world. But what they failed to see, what they could never see, was that their world had already died. Caesar didn't kill the Republic. The Republic killed itself. He just gave it a more efficient funeral. And yet, for all his power, for all his brilliance, for all his foresight, Caesar misjudged one thing. He thought the senators would never dare, that his mercy would buy him safety, that his myth would protect him. But myths are dangerous when they walk too long in the daylight. He believed he was inevitable, untouchable, and perhaps he was, until the moment he wasn't. They struck him in the heart of Rome, not in some battlefield far from home, but in the temple of the state, 23 times, surrounded, alone, eyes wide, blood falling on marble older than his name, and in that moment he became what none of them expected, immortal. Because you can kill a man, you can stain his robe, you can silence his breath, but you cannot erase an idea once it has made a home inside a civilization. His death did not revive the Republic. It destroyed it. The conspirators fled. Civil war returned, and out of the ashes rose something new. An empire, an emperor, and at its center, not Augustus, not Antony, but Caesar. His name would become a title, his image a relic, his reforms the foundation of centuries. Every ruler who followed chased his ghost. Every tyrant who rose whispered his strategies. Every dream of empire had him inked into its blueprint. The calendar bears his name. The monarchs bear his crown. The tyrants quote him. The people remember him. Statues crumble. Borders change. Languages evolve. But the myth of Caesar endures. So who was he, really? A hero to the masses, a tyrant to the elite, a victim of his own ambition, a man who believed in destiny and bent the world to fit it, a romantic wrapped in armor, a visionary armed with law, a poet of war, a general of peace, a man who crossed the Rubicon in body and dragged the entire world behind him. They killed the man, but they couldn't kill the idea.